Hello, and welcome to Conversations Worth Your While, a show in which I chat with really cool people about interesting topics to spark, inspire, and motivate both personal and professional change. And today's topic is Move Through the Hurt, Processing Grief Authentically. Everybody experiences loss, everybody grieves. And this conversation is worth your while because we're not taught how to grieve or how to support others who are grieving. Yet, grief happens every day, and especially during the last few years. So, the better you understand and recognize grief, the better equipped you'll be in the face of loss, and you'll be able to move through the hurt in a more effective way. So, we're going to cover three things today. First, people don't talk about grief, so we're going to talk about grief. Second, we're going to talk about why we shy away from grief. And then finally, we're going to share two ways that you can ease the pain of loss. So let's start with some introductions. I'm Linda Bucher. I'm a heart-centered master coach and mindset mentor, a transformative speaker, and an author. And I work with people who are excited about making a positive impact on the world. And they know there's this bigness inside them and they want to do more, be more, and have more joy, more fun, more balance, and more impact. But they recognize that there's something in the way. So if that is you, connect with me and I will help you get out of your own way, get the pain put aside, and unleash the bigness inside of you because you've got important shit to do in the world. And today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Margaret Dennis of Evolve Coaching. Margaret is a women's empowerment and grief coach. Hi, Margaret. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Hi, Linda. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. So, can you tell our audience a little bit more about what you do and who you serve?
Sure. As you said, I'm a women's empowerment and grief coach, and I work primarily with women, usually in the professional field, CEOs, entrepreneurs, women in business, help them to get unstuck, help them to figure out what's holding them back, because usually it's something that they're not aware of. And I
Mm,
get a lot of joy of working with women. And through my work, I've found that often grief comes up. And
mm,
so we do a lot of work with grief. It may not always be the primary focus of our sessions, but often it comes up. And so I do also have a branch within what I do where I do have women that do come to me strictly for grief.
mm.
And so we work through that and we teach them how to take back control of their life, honor their emotions, create new identities, and not completely like not go into like a Batman identity, but create a new identity for themselves that allows them to still honor the grief that they felt. So that's what I do.
Well, that's very beautiful. That's very beautiful. And yes, I have the exact same experience that clients come to me because they want one thing, but we've got to get what's in the way out of the way. And often
Hmm.
there is a grief component to that. And we
Hmm.
experience grief for many different reasons, not just in the wake of losing a human or
Correct.
even a pet, right? That's what we typically
Hmm.
talk about when we think about grief. But there's many other things, and we'll talk about that when we get started, that can
Hmm.
cause us to be grieving. So, once again, our topic is moving through the hurt, processing grief authentically. Um, and let's, first of all, we're not taught how to grieve. We're not taught how to support others who are grieving, right? So, and people don't talk about grief. So, let's talk about grief, Margaret. I'm going to let you get
Okay.
started.
Well, exactly what you said, Linda. People don't talk about it. Grief makes people uncomfortable. You see somebody that you know that's grieving, and you're saying, "Oh, I'm really sorry," but you really don't know what to do to help them. And that person doesn't even know how to ask for help either. They don't understand that they can, or they feel guilty. There's a lot of guilt associated with I'm feeling sad, but I don't want to upset anybody else. I don't want to make it uncomfortable for other people. So I think we all know about the big grievings, right? Like if we've lost a loved one, a parent, a spouse, a child, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, a close friend. We understand the idea of grief around death. What we don't understand is that there is grief in any type of loss.
Mm-hmm.
I do a workshop with women and I list off 30 different things that are all related to grief, and it's mind blowing when they had no idea. So it could be as much as, you didn't get that promotion at work,
Mm-hmm.
or your business went bankrupt, or you've lost your business for some reason. It could be I didn't I didn't get that first job that I ever wanted, or I got divorced and separated,
Mm-hmm.
or it could be anything that's a loss that's personal to you. It could be that my pet died. It could be that, my house burned down. It could be anything that's related to a loss.
Right.
And what happens over time is because we're not taught how to deal with grief, all of these little incidences or big incidences of grief pile on top of each other, and become compounded grief. And
Mm.
so you may think that, oh, I've never had a really big loss in my life. But all of a sudden you find yourself in your 40s or 50s snapping and having these outbursts of emotion and just really not understanding where they're coming from. But if you peel back the layers, you'll realize that you had all these little incidents happen throughout your lifetime that are now sitting inside of you because your body feels it, your body holds on to it.
Mm-hmm.
um, and it's something that you carry with you all the time. And because we've never been taught to either acknowledge it, talk about it, deal with it, then we don't.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so in our society, we're, especially in North America, right? Someone, if your spouse dies, or someone, a family member dies, you get 3 days off work. And then they're like, okay, off you go. And you could be a VP of marketing or a CEO of a company or the janitor. It doesn't matter, but you're still impacted by grief. Everyone feels it differently. Everyone's experience is unique. We're still impacted by it. And
Mm-hmm.
we still have to go back to work. We still have to function,
Right.
but we don't have any supports in place to allow us to do that in a way that allows us to grieve at our own pace and in
Right.
our own way.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of stuff about grief out there that is just unknown or
Mm-hmm.
not talked about.
Right.
So
Yeah, that's
yeah.
very true. We and I love, everybody experiences grief. So, my biggest experience of grief was I woke up one day. Well, actually, today is interesting. Today would have been my 30th wedding anniversary. But
Okay.
16 years ago, on a beautiful May morning, I woke up and my husband did not. He just died in his sleep, with no warning whatsoever. And I bring up the no warning whatsoever is because often what throws us into grief is no warning whatsoever. But then
Hmm.
there's other times that we do have a warning. We do understand that things are coming. So I have two sons that went into the military, right?
Hmm.
There was some grief experience there. Like, of course, there's going to be empty nest syndrome normally, like all moms and dads
Hmm.
experience this in some way. But when they're going to the military, there's a lot more fear attached to it versus just going to college, where I can go
Hmm.
pick them up,
Hmm.
what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, and so, and that wasn't sudden. I knew that was coming. I knew that was coming for a long time. So what throws us into grief is change. It's the change cycle that we get thrown into, and the catalyst, is not often a bad catalyst. What's interesting too is like I I had the grief of losing three pregnancies, but then
Hmm.
I had the joy of adopting three children. I adopted my children
Hmm.
from Russia. However, when I adopted my first son, what happened is my identity shifted. I went from single, not single, married. I was married. I went from being married, but like free to do whatever we wanted, whenever we wanted to a mother. Which, if anyone here is a mother, you recognize that is a lifelong obligation. It doesn't
Yes.
stop. Um, and so, my identity shifted, and to
Hmm.
grieve that loss of that identity, I cannot go back. It's like the caterpillar becoming a butterfly. It's a beautiful thing. Butterfly can do so much more and has a whole different world, but
Hmm.
you can't go back to being that caterpillar. Like, it's just
Right.
not possible. And that's why we have to grieve that identity shift. If you win the lottery, you're still going to have an identity shift, and you're going to have to grieve that simpler time. So
Hmm.
it's not always, I like what you brought up, it's not always about the loss of a person.
No.
So it's really just about a big change always throws us into grief in some way.
Hmm.
So let's now
Agreed.
move on to why we shy away from grief.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yes, it's very uncomfortable. Grief is something that, like, we have in our, like, we get something when we get the initial impact of grief, especially if it's really traumatic and deeply impactful. There's something called grief brain. So our grief brain, if you've heard of mummy brain, right? Like
Mhm.
mummy brain, when you've had a baby, you get all foggy and you're tired and you're disconnected and you can't make decisions. Well, the same thing happens when you get thrown into a really big grief, is your brain takes over. It puts you into fight or flight mode, or freeze, I guess. Fight, flight, or freeze. And so it's a coping mechanism. It's a
Mhm.
physical reaction. There literally are chemicals released in your brain to process this grief. And it's just a physical reaction to it. And so we get thrown into that. We really get thrown into that. And then as we're coming out of it, that's when we really start to feel those emotions and they come through. And so it becomes, when you're starting to express those emotions and you're starting to deal with it, the people around you get very uncomfortable. And you can get really uncomfortable with yourself because you're like, I don't know how to make this stop. I've had women come to me and say, I'm afraid to cry because I don't think I'm ever going to stop.
Yes.
And that's something that we want to reassure you. You will stop. You may cry a lot, and that's okay, but it will stop. But it won't, it'll change. I guess I don't even want to say it'll stop. It will change. It may not be as intense, but this whole idea of it's really uncomfortable, right? When we show emotions, we become vulnerable, and people don't like being vulnerable, and people around them don't like to see the vulnerability because it's a reflection back on them that they could be vulnerable, right?
Exactly.
And so there is that that whole dynamic that happens. And then you throw in the lovely, our cultural and society expectations around grief is that, you should only have a certain amount of time, or, you should, the famous sayings of be brave, be strong, you'll get over it, it'll just take time. And that is, quite honestly, the worst advice you could ever give to somebody who's grieving. Like, just sit with them and let them cry.
Hmm.
Just sit. You
Yeah.
don't even have to say anything. You just say, I'm here for you if you need me.
Right. You just
And
love
so
them.
just
Yeah.
love them and be there, and allow them a space to release these emotions, because otherwise, and which is what the majority of society does, we push them down and push them down and think we have to grieve in a certain way. And we think we can't share that we're still sad 5 years later after our spouse died. Or you can't share that there's still that element of I miss them. Or because when people keep saying move on, that's not their choice, that's your choice. And so it's really, how do you figure out
Right.
this walk of grief as you move forward with it, and how do you get from the grief incident to where you want to be now? And it's a
Hmm.
journey. It really is a journey.
Hmm.
And it's unfortunate, but it tends to be a very lonely journey, and we suffer in silence a lot.
Right. And it
And
doesn't have
it's
to be. And that's why
no.
people like me and you can help with
Mm-hmm.
that. I remember when I
100%.
went into a grief group about two
Mm-hmm.
months after my husband had died. And yes, I was in that foggy brain. It was actually about a year and a half long. I was in a
Mm-hmm.
time warp. Everything
Yeah.
that it felt like, oh, that was last year, but it was actually 2.5 years ago. I had to add a year and a half to
Mm.
everything because that was a
Wow.
crazy brain fog time warp time. And I remember
Mm-hmm.
I thought I was making all these wise decisions because I was moving on adrenaline at the very
Right.
beginning for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And about 2 months in, I went to a grief group, put my children in a grief group. They were like 3, 5, and 7 at the time. Um, and so I was in there, and the other people were in there. We all had to introduce ourselves, our names, who we lost, and how long ago we had lost that person. I said, my name's Linda. My husband died 2 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
As we went around the room, everyone else was in there and their spouse had passed away 9 years ago, 12 years ago. And I thought to myself, oh, I'm not going to feel the way I feel right now. There's no way I'm going to let myself feel that way 9 years and 12 years from now. I have
Mm-hmm.
children to raise. I have to, I need to heal, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
deliberately healing. Like, this is it. I'm doing whatever it takes. I don't know what's going to take because I didn't know my way around grief at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew I didn't want to feel this intense pain I was feeling
Mm-hmm.
years from now, 5, 9, 12 years from now. And I think I intuitively knew it didn't need to be the case.
Mm-hmm.
And so now it's been 16 years since my husband passed away. Today would have been our 30th wedding anniversary.
Yeah.
And I feel no pain. I feel peace.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and it's not just time. That's a really
Yeah.
bad piece of advice because it's not time that let me
No.
get to peace. It was not time. It was intentionally grieving what's called clean pain and
Mm-hmm.
intentionally questioning the thoughts that cause dirty pain. And if you don't know
Mhm.
the difference, which is what the people in that grief group did not know the difference, all those years they had been crying. If you're crying for 12 years, you're probably attempting to grieve away dirty pain, and it cannot be grieved. Dirty
Mhm.
pain is caused by thoughts, and clean pain is caused by truth. So when my thought, when I was saying, I'll never hold my husband's hand again, that's irrefutably true. So when that made me sad, that's clean pain, and that pain needs to be grieved. But when I said the next thing that happened is, and now I'm going to have to raise these kids alone, that is not irrefutably true. So when I was focusing on that and feeling pain and crying, that could never be cried away, because that is
Mhm.
just an untrue thought. And
Right.
that's where most people on their grief journey, they're not aware, like you and I are, of coaches, as coaches, that so much pain is caused by thinking and not by reality. And if we can separate the two, which is the most
Mhm.
important thing we can do, we can get on with the important business of grieving the clean pain and the
Mhm.
important business of not believing our thoughts that are causing dirty pain. And that's why once the clean pain has been grieved, that's how we get to peace. It's not about time. It's
Mm-mm.
not.
No.
Um, and I think that group proved it, and I think that I prove it as well. Being in a place of peace,
Mhm. Mhm.
and yeah. So this is a really important thing to understand is, am I crying and feeling sad and sorrow because of something I'm thinking? Right. So
Mhm.
what you brought up, like passed over for promotion, right? There's a loss there, right?
Mhm.
And the loss is the loss of your expectation, the excitement, the thing that you imagine yourself being
Yep.
there, right?
Right.
But when your brain goes to thoughts like, no one understands my worth, maybe I'm not worth it, those are just thoughts. Those are not true, which means the
Mhm.
pain associated with those cannot be cried away. You cannot grieve that away. So we have to be
No.
very clear as to what is just a thought, and a big hint is it's in the future,
Mhm.
or it's
Yep.
about your self-worth, right? Something like that. That's just a bunch of thinking that you and I can help people move through. Whereas the irrefutably true, right? This is
Mhm.
not, it didn't meet my expectations. Okay, that's true. It didn't meet my
Yep.
expectations were here, right? And so that's a huge, super important. I feel like if people get anything else out of this conversation, they need to understand the difference, because only then can they begin to grieve that which is grievable, and stop
Mhm.
trying to grieve over something that is not grievable, because it has to be what we say disbelievable. That's what you do with
Mhm.
that. You grieve and you disbelieve. You got to know which to grieve and which to disbelieve.
Mhm. Mhm. And to your point of actually being proactive in your own grief, right?
Mm-hmm.
I also help support women in being proactive. You've got to want to do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to be able to do the work to do it. And that takes a lot of courage, and it takes a lot of desire to want to do that as well. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to do that. Absolutely nothing wrong in wanting to deal with your grief and go through the grieving process
Mm-hmm.
on your terms in the
On
way
your
that
turn.
works for you, you
Right.
know?
Yes.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree. In a way that works for you. That's a very important point to
Hmm.
make. Um, because some people might grieve through action, like going for a run
Hmm.
every day. That's where
Hmm.
that's their time to release and let things go, right? Where, for other people, they're not going to be doing that. So how we grieve is individual, as each of is ours, as long as we
Hmm.
make sure we're grieving the clean pain, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
So let's just move on to some different ways that we can ease the pain of loss. I love that you brought up that people don't want to start crying because they're afraid they can't stop. So the
Hmm.
way I explain that when I'm working with my clients is, I say it's like a tsunami. You got to hold the dam up. Like, you can't let that come in. They're afraid they're going to drown in their grief. They
Hmm.
recognize that they don't have the capacity to be able to drown. They have responsibilities. They have to support themselves. Maybe they have families to support,
Hmm.
right? They just because they're going through something doesn't mean it should impact our children, our friends, our family, our coworkers, right? We recognize that there's something inherently unfair about that. So
Hmm.
sometimes we want to just sweep it under the rug, right? And it's, just, I know I'm mixing metaphors. I'm sorry. We got tsunamis, we got rugs, but we want to run away from it because we're afraid we're going to drown. So I
Hmm.
created a tool that I called Room to Grieve, which I'll share with our audience now. And what it's designed to do is to help you grieve only the clean pain in a way that it's being released, because there is a finite amount of it. I know this from my
Hmm.
own experience. There's a finite amount of painful pain that's clean pain. And if you can
Hmm.
just grieve it a little tiny bit at a time and in a deliberate way, it's every time you do it, you have less pain inside of you than you had 10 minutes ago. So,
Hmm.
this is how we can do it in very small pieces. And most people will agree to do something in very small pieces. Oh, if it's not going to overwhelm me, if I'm still going to be able to function, I will commit to doing it. So, room to grieve is about giving yourself a permission and room to grieve. But if you know it's not going to overwhelm you, it's easier to give yourself permission and room to
Hmm.
grieve.
Hmm.
And so what you do is you go into a very small room, like a powder room in your house. Close the windows, close the doors. It doesn't matter what the light is doing. And let out that sorrow. Sorrow comes in 90-second waves. And if you've been through loss, then you can do anything for 90 seconds. Okay.
Hmm.
We have this strength, this internal strength. We can look back and say, wow, look how strong I am.
Hmm.
And so you can use that strength for 90 seconds to get through anything, any amount of sorrow. And you just let it out, remembering it has to
Hmm.
be the clean pain, or else it's not going to help in any way if it's dirty pain. So letting it out. Only as much sorrows will fill this small room. And that's where the safety comes in. Oh, it's not going to overwhelm me. I only have to fill up the room. And you'll know. You'll just know when it's filled up. When it's filled up, you can open the window, open the door, and let it out. That is that much more sorrow that is no longer inside you. That grief has been released, right? And it can be released, you can say, to the universe, to God, whatever feels, good for you and true for you. It's just a good way to release it. If you're so inclined, you can shut the door and do it again. If you're
Hmm.
not so inclined, that's fine. But you've deliberately released some grief. Now, what happens, and people might remember this from when they're kids, or if you ever had a big good cry, is there's this peace that comes at the end, a big giant sigh. That giant sigh, and it brings you to
Hmm.
peace. That's what happens when grief is released. And give that some attention. Don't just go on to the next thing, right?
Hmm.
you know, just give that some space to be there. That
Hmm.
feeling of peace, right? And it's like a stillness. It's a
Hmm.
beautiful, beautiful thing. And that's what happens when you release some grief. So this room to grieve tool, my clients say it's very effective. I know for sure that it is. And it's a beautiful tool. And I
Hmm.
know, Margaret, that you have some things to share,
Thank you.
as well. So I'd love if you would do that.
Sure, thank you. And I have to say, I love your room to grieve. I think it's a fantastic tool. And I have started sharing it with my clients as well because I think it is phenomenal.
Thank you.
Um, so what I would do when I work with my clients is I do this as a workshop. It's called the Empowered Grief Warrior Workshop for women, and I also take the women that I work with through this process through coaching as well. So I can either do it one to one with them or I do it in a workshop. And really, it's a little bit of education around grief, but it looks at um, how do you create this new identity of
Mm,
who you are becoming? Because you are never the same person after grief as before grief. So
right.
for me, with my story, I lost my son when he was 3 days old. He was the twin to my daughter. So for me, I was a grieving mom and I was a brand new happy mom. Like, how did you do that? So
Mm,
I just pushed my grief down. But I had to figure out how to become this new person. Um, and I teach other women too. Like if they come in through the program, it's I was a wife, now I'm a widow, right? I was a mom, now I don't have a child. Or I was a daughter and now my parent has passed. Like you're in those particular death scenarios, right? Where people they have to figure out who they are now.
right.
And so a lot of the work that I do is I take them through this journey of creating this new identity for themselves in a safe space where it's not like I'm going to walk out of the room right now, like, 90 minutes through the workshop or whatever, and figure that out. But it's, how do you figure that out? And a lot of what I do with them is a lot of journal prompting.
Mm-hmm.
Things like, what do I want to let go of that's not serving me now?
Mm-hmm.
Is it, I don't want to be sad. Like, I don't want to be angry anymore. I don't want to be sad anymore. I don't want to be resentful that they left. I don't want to look at that picture on the wall anymore. What is it that you want to release? And then the really big important question is, what do I want to remember and bring forward with me?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to remember being happy. I want to remember how much they made me laugh. I want to remember, the smell of my mom's scarf. So I'm going to bring her scarf with me as a memento. I want to remember the things that bring me joy or that bring me peace and still connect me maybe to that person or that memory or that event. And then how can I move forward and take the positive stuff that I really want to carry and remember? And how can I let go of the things that really aren't serving me? And so when I take those things, okay, how do I want to show up in the world now? Who do I want to be? And how can I incorporate these things into this new person that I've become? And so it's more of a journey that I
Mm-hmm.
take people on. It's a lot of deep diving into what's important to them and what, things have changed in your life. They could have changed monumentally. How do
Mm-hmm.
you want to show up?
Mm-hmm.
And so we create that new vision and that new identity for them. And it's not that you are a completely different person, because you're never a completely different person. You're kind of like, the image I like to get is that you've shattered glass and you're putting the pieces back together. They never fit perfectly back together. You're still you,
Mm-hmm.
but now you've got a few cracks and a few things that have been added to that picture. And you've created this even better version of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I know people will sometimes, when you say better version, yeah, because you've been through a lot and you are strong and you are moving forward.
Right.
And it's okay to move forward.
It
That's
is.
the
I love
big
that you
thing.
brought that up.
Yeah,
And
it's
I
okay to move
agree.
forward.
My identity shifted
Mhm,
in a giant way. Um,
mhm,
and it was really a discovery process of who am I now? And you're right, most of me was still the same, but there was new parts of me, new gifts and talents that came to the surface that I must not have had room for in the past, right?
mhm,
When I no longer was a wife, I had some space for something else. I said, well, I'm going to use this time and space to discover who I am. That was a natural
mhm,
thing. I discovered some knacks for like decorating and the creative side of me that I had been suppressing for a long time. So
mhm.
it was a beautiful discovery, and it takes time. It happens after the grieving. Like the grieving is the
Right.
stage, first stage, and we're not doing anything big in the grieving stage.
No,
We are
no.
sitting with our emotions, letting them be, giving ourselves permission to grieve, and disbelieving that dirty pain.
Right.
But eventually we feel this change happening, and this is
Mhm,
like in the butterfly analogy, right? So the in the first stage is death and rebirth, right? This is the rebirth
mhm,
of our new identity. And that's where the caterpillar just spins that saliva sleeping bag, right? Crawls in, turns into goo. It's neither here nor there. It's neither a
mhm,
caterpillar nor a butterfly. It can't even dream like a butterfly. That's in grief. You can't. Then people saying, "Oh, it's going to get better." You can't be in that future and know that there's going to be all these flowers for the butterfly to, like, you don't know that. But when you move into the second stage of the change cycle, the cycle of change, that's where you're dreaming and you're discovering what might be, and
mhm,
that happens while you're discovering you. Who am I? And who am I has to do with these beautiful prompts that you are giving. I also have probably 40 prompts that I do when
mhm,
I'm working with people in the same way. And it's who am I now? What have I discovered in light of all those
mhm,
circumstances, in light of what's happened? I've discovered, like for me, I discovered how strong I was. I don't think
mhm,
that circumstances make you stronger. I think they reveal how strong you are that you didn't
mhm.
even know,
Yeah.
right? Like that was my biggest aha. It's like, whoa, I am so strong. I didn't know
Mhm.
this. I never knew this about myself, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a beautiful identity shift. So it's one of those things where they say sometimes the worst thing to happen to you was the best thing to happen to you. And in my case, that's what
Mhm.
happened, because the
Mhm.
who of me that I discovered after my husband passed away over the subsequent years was the most profound transformation I've ever gone through.
Mhm.
And it led me to being the person I'm meant to be for my children, and to be able to do that, what I do for a living, which I never would
Mhm.
be doing if that hadn't happened, right?
Mhm.
So it's this discovery is such an important piece that naturally happens when you move through the grieving stage into the
Mhm.
discovery stage. And it's really
Right.
about noticing, like, what appeals to you. So things you might never like, no, I never wanted a canoe. Now you're like, oh my God, I got a canoe every day. I love canoeing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. So you have
Yeah.
notice, right? And just kind of
Mhm.
narrow it down. And then you're like, oh, it's this. And that's when, and what I noticed is that change, you can kind of tell when that's happening, that new discovery change is naturally happening, because you'll feel inclined to redecorate your house, paint the rooms, change your haircut, throw away your
Mhm.
wardrobe, get a new wardrobe. You'll feel this new identity coming.
Mhm.
And it's actually a very beautiful thing. But I know a lot of times when that happens, people then experience guilt. Does this mean
Mhm.
I no longer, you know, maybe I'm supposed to still be sad? What's wrong with me?
Mhm.
And it's really
Mhm.
that you've done the grieving, you've come to peace, and those
Yeah.
beautiful, those happy memories. How do I want to remember this person? Where do I want to
Mhm.
keep them in my heart, right? In a
Yeah.
beautiful way, in light of funny stories, or things like that. And so there's
Mhm.
no need for that guilt at
No.
all, because it doesn't
No.
serve anybody, and it doesn't make you a better person because you feel guilty. You're not
Right.
supposed to feel guilty.
No. No, you're not. And it's hard for some people to let go of that guilt.
It is.
And but even just being able to hear the words, you do not need to feel guilty. It's like
Mhm.
giving yourself permission.
Right.
That's important. It's
Yeah.
really important.
And it happened
Yeah.
in the midst of grief for me too. Um,
Mhm.
because my marriage wasn't easy, and my husband was an alcoholic, and it was really kind of tough.
Mhm.
And I experienced some relief, and then I
Mhm.
immediately the guilt came in.
Guilt.
Woo! What do you mean you're relieved? You're supposed to just be sad, not relieved.
Mhm.
you know.
Mhm.
So I felt sorrow, relief, and guilt all at the same
Same
time.
time.
It was nuts. It was
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think grief doesn't just happen as a single emotion. You're right. There's all kinds of other emotions that
Yeah.
pile on top of that too. And it's sifting through those emotions and understanding that every single emotion you have is okay,
Hmm.
and that it's normal, and that it's natural, and that you are allowed to feel the way you feel. And
Yeah.
I think you put judgment on it, right? It's like you said, I'm not supposed to feel this way.
Right.
Or you're absolutely terrified to say to other people, oh, I felt relief, because then people will think you might be a bad person, or you
Right.
might
They're
be a
gonna
bad,
judge you.
like there's all this judging that comes on. So there's so many layers, and a lot of it happens subconsciously. People just aren't aware that that's what's influencing them.
Yeah.
So,
Our emotions are, except for clean pain, our emotions are always caused by our thoughts, right?
mhm,
So, um, if you, but most people don't know what we're thinking. We just immediately feel this emotion. So that's
mhm,
why we want to sit with these emotions and think of them as messengers. They're
mhm,
letting us know something. And if we can, like, have coffee, like, with the emotion, how would you, like, if this, I was having coffee with this emotion right next to me, right? How
mhm,
would I treat this emotion? What would I say, right?
right,
And what might I inquire about it? That's
mhm,
where you can really get through to say, that's how you get to, what am I actually thinking, and is that dirty pain, right?
mhm,
So, but
mhm,
being there, giving it room, allowing it to be there, just allowing it is a releasing process. It's the craziest
mhm.
thing. When you allow it to be there, you
Yeah.
release. So it's
Yes,
very beautiful.
it
I
really
think,
is.
Margaret, that we've talked about so many beautiful things today. I hope this has been very helpful to our audience. I want to thank
Mhm.
you so much for
Oh,
being
thank
a
you.
guest today. And I will put a link to your website into the description so people can connect with you and learn more about your workshop.
Great, thank you.
And that would be a very beautiful thing. And once again, I am Linda Bucher, and I'm helping you to lighten your load, unleash that bigness inside of you, and make an impact while living a balanced, rewarding life. And I'd like to thank Margaret Dennis of Evolve Coaching, as well as you, our audience, for sharing your time with me today. So please subscribe and remember to check the description where you'll find our contact information and free tools and resources. And until next time, make sure that you've made this conversation worth your while by fueling the spark that it ignited.